Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 93 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. This is another solo episode where I share my own research with you. This is the story of how a failed professional hit on a businessman in Irvine, California, led to the discovery of a cache of buried machine guns, stockpiles of biological weapons, and a conspiratorial relationship between an American doctor and South Africa's illicit biological warfare program known as Project Coast in the mid-1980s. But before we dive into this story, I want to tell you all about my favorite fragrance for daily wear. It's called Novichok by Clandestine Laboratories. Novichok is distinctive and combines notes of cocoa powder, chocolate almond tort, rose, jasmine, cinnamon, tonka bean, Peru balsam, and musk tonkin. Unlike some of the other clones I've worn in the past, I've found that Novichok stays with me all day, which was a pleasant surprise. If the name sounds familiar to you, then you might already know why I was so happy to find this company and support them. The name itself comes from the very well-known Russian nerve agent Novichok, which has been used in recent years in several assassination attempts, which I've covered here on the podcast in previous episodes. The name is spelled differently, but rest assured, once you put this on, you'll still make a killer impression wherever you go. Novichok is made in small batches by Clandestine Laboratories and, like their entire lineup, is available only via direct order. If you're not sure which of their fragrances is right for you, you can also check out the Discovery Stash, 6 different mini bottles at one great price, which is perfect for finding your signature scent. So make sure to check them out either via a link in the show notes of this episode or at their website, clandestinelaboratories.com, or on Instagram at Clandestine Laboratories. On the morning of February 28th, 2000, James Patrick Riley was shot in the face by a masked gunman as he got out of his car to walk into his office. Riley was the owner of a research laboratory called Biofem, Incorporated, in Irvine, California. As he walked from his car into the entrance to his office, witnesses at a bank across the street saw a man wearing a mask and dressed all in black run towards him. They initially thought the bank was about to be robbed and took cover, but the man fired a single shot at Riley just as Riley turned towards him. Riley's turn towards the hitman probably saved his life because the bullet went through his lip and cheek, but didn't do much other damage as it passed through his face before hitting the window of the bank. He fell on the ground, bleeding heavily, while the hitman turned and ran back the way he'd come, and was picked up a few seconds later by someone driving a silver Ford Aerostar minivan. A bank employee took down the license plate number of the van and reported it to the police. Meanwhile, Riley took out a cell phone and called his business partner named Larry Ford, who was just inside the building. Dr. Ford was a gynecologist and microbiologist who was the head researcher for Biofem, and he ran outside immediately to render first aid for Riley. Fortunately for Riley, the bullet wound was relatively minor, and he was almost fully recovered within a few weeks, although, of course, he would carry the physical and mental scars from the attack for the rest of his life. But Riley's survival was far less fortunate for his partner, Larry Ford, because it was Ford who'd arranged the hit in the first place. In fact, Ford had been on the phone with the driver of the minivan moments before the hit and had watched it happen from his office window. Ford must have realized that all his plans were falling apart in that instant, but Riley had no idea that his partner, who was working to staunch the bleeding just then, had planned it all along. Ford was a talented and maybe even a visionary researcher, but it doesn't look like he knew how to cover his own tracks when plotting a murder, because he was the prime suspect within days. Once the Irvine Police Department began to investigate, the trail led straight to him. The silver Ford Aerostar minivan that was the hitman's getaway vehicle was owned by Dino DeSax, a tax consultant and businessman who had been friends with Larry Ford for around 15 years. Police arrived at Dissac's home the very same day of the shooting, and a search turned up a book on how to plan a murder. They also found a map of the Biofilm parking lot with Riley's personal parking space marked with an X, among other evidence. Dissac's was eventually convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 26 years in prison, but he never revealed the name of the actual triggerman, despite a plea offer from prosecutors. So the gunman is still unidentified to this day. But Ford's story came to its conclusion much more quickly. The day after Riley's shooting, police searched Ford's home for the first time. The day after that, on March 2nd, 2000, Ford spent several hours at his attorney's office completing a 5-page handwritten statement. He then went home and laid the statement near his bed, then put a double-barreled shotgun under his chin and pulled the trigger. His wife heard the shot and called the police without going upstairs to check, which was probably the smart move on her part. Although the prime suspect in the hit was now dead, police had to continue their investigation. Ford's primary motive for killing his business partner was financial, which is probably no surprise. It seems he felt like he was being held back by his contract with Riley and Biofilm because Riley was set to receive 50% of the profit from any new drugs developed by Dr. Ford. And Ford was working on something that both he and Biofilm as a whole believed would potentially save millions of lives and be worth billions of dollars. For the last few years leading up to the shooting, Biofilm had been working on a new drug they called inner confidence. In layman's terms, it was essentially a contraceptive and microbicide, which Dr. Ford hoped would help prevent women from contracting HIV or AIDS during intercourse. He had already patented the drug and told potential investors that he believed Biofilm would see $400 million in annual sales once it was available. So it's easy to see why Dr. Ford and Riley both would see the tremendous financial upside to developing a successful drug of that type. At first glance, all of this is tragic and gruesome, but also somewhat unsurprising and fairly straightforward, at least as far as murder plots go. But as the police dug deeper into Dr. Ford's life, they began to realize there was far more to his story than was initially known. And that investigation would involve the CIA, the FBI, the ATF, and even the apartheid-era government of South Africa.
We'll be right back.
Hello, nerds. Come listen to the History Nerds United podcast, and let's make history fun again. We interview today's best authors, whether they are established Pulitzer Prize winners or someone debuting their first book. Let us show you that history is not a boring class you took in high school, but a place where the best stories come from. And we don't just cover history, we also love to chat about true crime, biographies, memoirs, and so much more. So head on over to History Nerds United and let us introduce you to your new favorite book and learn the story behind the story.
History Nerds United.
Ford's handwritten suicide note made mention of materials hidden around his home that would be of interest to the police. The day after his death, a man named Peter Fitzpatrick, who had worked as a source for the FBI in the mid-1980s, called the local FBI office and the prosecutor's office to warn them about what they might find at Ford's house. Fitzpatrick had known about Ford for nearly 15 years and told the FBI agents they should wear protective gear when searching his house and be mindful of potential booby traps. So a search warrant was executed, which turned up a wide variety of evidence, and every piece of it was more shocking than the last. For starters, more than 260 bottles and vials of deadly germs and toxins were discovered all over his home. Ford had containers of salmonella, botulism, cholera, and typhoid on hand, mostly stored in a freezer in his home. He had a sample of ricin poison derived from castor beans hidden alongside 2 blow dart guns. At the Biofilm laboratory, more deadly poisons and biological agents were stored in a refrigerator next to employee lunches and a bottle of ranch salad dressing, allegedly. After investigators realized what they were looking at, they evacuated 52 families from nearby homes and put them all up in a hotel while they continued their search using full protective suits and equipment, including a remote-controlled tracked robot. The week after Ford's suicide, another search of his property uncovered a large cache of weapons buried in his backyard. Many of his associates had long known that Ford had a serious interest in firearms. And besides the shotgun he'd used to kill himself, he had several other rifles and pistols stored inside. But police found several long plastic canisters buried in the backyard near the swimming pool, which contained around 60 firearms, including several unregistered machine guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and even an entire case of C4 plastic explosives and detonators. They found a .45 caliber Thompson submachine gun, a pair of FN-FAL rifles, a pair of Mac 11 9mm submachine guns, a British Sten submachine gun, a Steyr AUG, an M16, and dozens of other semi-automatic firearms, which were all removed by the police from his property over the course of 3 days. Besides the weapons in the backyard and elsewhere in his house, investigators also found a huge stack of medical files hidden underneath the floorboards. The files were for 83 of Dr. Ford's female patients dating back many years, and it was initially unclear why he would have kept the files hidden at home. But once they began interviewing some of the women, a theory developed that Ford had been conducting secret and illegal medical experiments on the women without their knowledge or consent. He appeared to be doing human trials of the drug long before receiving any approval from the Food and Drug Administration, simply by giving the drug to his existing patients without them knowing. Most of Ford's social circle saw him as a loving family man. He was seemingly a devout Mormon with no real vices other than frequently drinking Diet Coke, which violated the prohibition against caffeine by the Mormon Church. He was also married and had 3 children, all of whom turned out well. Up until his shocking death, he had no criminal record whatsoever. But in reality, Ford had been carrying on an affair with his lab assistant named Valerie Kesler for the past 18 years, although that was probably the least of his sins, quite frankly. The two worked together, traveled together, and Valerie may have even helped him plan Riley's murder beforehand. Certainly, she could be considered Ford's partner in crime. The night after Riley was shot, she was inside the lab at Biofilm, deleting all of Ford's files from the computer system there. After she was picked up for questioning, her gray Chevy Camaro was impounded by the police. She denied knowing anything about the attack on Riley, but after she spoke with her attorney, he immediately advised police that they should be extremely careful handling a tote bag in the trunk of her vehicle. According to the lawyer, there was a firearm in the bag and a knife which had been coated with ricin, the poison. The FBI called in their own weapons of mass destruction response team, who used a robot to remove the bag from her vehicle. Inside, they found a knife, an Uzi pistol, just as the lawyer had described. They also later found an FN rifle in her home, along with a couple of other weapons, I believe. Before testing the knife for any chemicals, though, they sterilized it thoroughly in case there was actually a serious threat. That, unfortunately, negated the possibility of determining if it really was coated with ricin, but with everything that we know about Ford now, it's probably a safe bet that Kesler's attorney was correct about the danger posed by that particular knife. Kesler was indicted for possessing and transporting illegal weapons, and in December 2001, she took a plea deal from the prosecutors and was sentenced to 3 years probation on those charges. Well, as a researcher who was ostensibly looking for cures and methods to prevent diseases, it certainly makes sense that Ford would have access to salmonella and cholera and some of the other samples that were found afterwards with the search warrants. But his possession and even use of these biological agents went far beyond simple research, and although we'll probably never know for sure, it's likely that he wasn't just working with them in the lab, but was experimenting on his patients and even some of his friends and associates. Ford had a longtime friend named Ian Shane who worked at a gun shop in Culver City, California, called Red Star Militaria. Shane was very sick for many years from several different ailments, all of them somewhat rare, including sarcoidosis. Sarcoidosis is a chronic lung and immune system disease which is very rare overall and is 3 times more prevalent among African Americans than anyone else. Shane was white. He was convinced that Ford had something to do with him contracting sarcoidosis, although there was no way to know for sure. Shane finally passed away in 2014 after being in poor health for almost 20 years. A number of Dr. Ford's former patients also reported that they'd suffered from unusual and seemingly incurable ailments, which started while they were being treated by Dr. Ford. The most common theory is that he was testing the inner confidence drug on his patients, and some of them were suffering previously unforeseen side effects. It later turned out that the drug was actually making women more susceptible to sexually transmitted diseases rather than less. So Biofilm was never able to get FDA approval or bring it to market after Ford's death. Officials from the Orange County Department of Health interviewed many of Ford's former patients to determine if there might be a risk to public health. They ultimately closed that inquiry after finding there was no public risk, but that doesn't mean that Ford wasn't deliberately infecting his patients. And all of those who reported suspicions about their treatment with Dr. Ford also stated they'd been sedated and unconscious at some point during their treatments, so they wouldn't have known what he might have done to them during that time. Every day, you're under attack, whether you realize it or not. Your digital devices contain your entire life, your finances, your conversations with friends and family, your interests, and even your movements. And all of that is vulnerable to an ever-expanding class of criminals, scam artists, hackers, and even governments. You don't want to leave your data security entirely in the hands of your ISP, or anyone else for that matter. It's up to you to protect yourself using a multi-layered defense strategy. Silent offers you the protection you need to keep your data and devices secure from wireless threats. Their multi-shield technology blocks cellular signals, GPS, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, EMP, RFID, NFC, and more. Silent's lineup includes everything from signal blocking wallets all the way up to 40 cubic liter Faraday duffel bags. When you're geared up with Silent, you'll be truly disconnected, undetectable, untraceable, and unhackable. And you can now use the discount code Spycraft101 to save 10% off your order from Silent. Find them at slnt.com. That's slnt.com. Not only that, but he may even have been deliberately infecting some people with unknown drugs or chemicals as a form of revenge. A woman named Shane Gregory came forward and said that she'd been suffering a mystery illness as well, which included severe bouts of vertigo for more than 15 years. She dated Ford for about 3 years between 1981 and 1984 when she was a student at UCLA. Her problems began shortly after they broke up. Over the years, she tried a wide variety of treatments, including various medications and even 2 separate brain surgeries, but never recovered or even fully identified the cause of her illness. Other witnesses also told investigators about their own unexplained illnesses, and 2 friends of Ford said he had confided in them that he had deliberately infected his ex-girlfriend Shane Gregory with a, quote, alpha toxin, unquote, although they didn't know specifically what that might have been. When Detective Ray of the Irvine Police Department interviewed the owner of a pharmaceutical company that had worked with Ford to develop an anti-wrinkle cream, she told him that at one point, Ford had become upset with another executive at her company for some reason. Ford walked into the man's office carrying a cardboard box containing a live rabbit. He set the box on the man's desk, then put on a pair of latex gloves and took a syringe out of his pocket. He allowed 2 droplets to fall from the needle of the syringe onto the rabbit's shoulder. The rabbit started having convulsions immediately and died with blood coming out of its nose and ears. Ford then left the man's office, leaving the dead rabbit on his desk, all without saying a single word. So for Detective Ray and the other investigators on this case, it was starting to look like Larry Ford was capable of almost anything. Well, for whatever reason, Dr. Ford liked to brag to some of his friends about his exploits, including that he had once parachuted into South Africa in order to take blood samples from dead guerrilla fighters. Those blood samples would help the U.S. government learn what vaccines the fighters had received against biological weapons, according to Ford. He also had a photo of himself as a young man in a military uniform, although he never served in the armed forces. And he claimed to multiple people that he had worked for and with the Central Intelligence Agency. Those Irvine detectives initially ignored these kind of claims, but evidence began to mount that at least some of them were accurate. The lead detective on the case, Victor Ray, asked the FBI's liaison to the CIA to determine if Ford had any connection to the CIA. The FBI liaison came back very quickly with the answer, yes, he did. The details weren't specified to Detective Ray, but the connection was real. To me, it makes sense that someone like Dr. Ford would be of interest to the CIA. He developed a lot of powerful contacts in the South African government all on his own, which I'll cover shortly. So as a potential human intelligence source, it stands to reason that they would like to know what those contacts were thinking, what they were interested in, and what their future plans and objectives might be. So perhaps he was being pre-briefed or debriefed before and after his trips to South Africa and providing useful information. But if he was employed by them as a contractor or consultant or something like that for his research and experiments, that's an altogether different story. And it's one that isn't clear at all, even 23 years after his death. I'm not sure when or if we'll ever know the truth of that. If his claim of taking blood samples from dead foreign fighters is accurate, that's a much different relationship than simply passing along information verbally to a handler. That would presumably involve smuggling those blood samples onto international flights, something that Ford was entirely capable of and willing to do. Ford also claimed to have worked at the U.S. Army's Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick, Maryland, many years earlier, as a teenager, in fact. Known by the acronym USAMRIID, the facility is infamous for its ties to biological weapons programs and even to the MK-Ultra program. It seems unlikely that he might have worked there at such a young age, regardless of his early signs of brilliance, and the organization's commander later told reporters that there was no record of Ford ever working with them. But I don't think that is surprising to anyone listening to this, and I don't think they would have acknowledged any link to him after Ford had already been in the news for the attempted murder and links to South Africa. So it's not clear if he ever worked at Fort Detrick or not, but in his possessions, police did find a pamphlet intended to welcome newcomers to USAMRIID. And of course, his later resume was certainly in line with exactly the kind of work that USAMRIID would be interested in. So perhaps he had some sort of unofficial relationship with them as well. It's just another anomaly and unanswered question in Ford's story, and there are certainly a lot of those already. To understand Ford's ties to South Africa, you have to be aware of Project Coast and its impact on the government's work to maintain control over their country. Project Coast was a highly secretive and highly successful program run by the South African Defense Forces to produce chemical and biological weapons. The South African government signed on to the International Biological and Toxins Weapons Convention in 1972, but nevertheless initiated Project Coast in 1981 and didn't terminate it until 1995. It was financed by the Minister of Defense, but run under the authority of the Surgeon General named Neil Noble. 3 different front companies did the majority of the research, development, and production of chemical and biological weapons for the SADF during that time. The project was overseen by Dr. Wouter Basson, who later became known in the press as Dr. Death and as the South African Dr. Mengele. Basson joined the SADF as a medical officer in 1979 and rose quickly through the ranks. Just 9 years later, he was a brigadier general and the head of medical staff operations for the entire SADF. From that position, he was selected by the Surgeon General to become the head of research and development and simultaneously as the head of Project Coast. The majority of the chemical weapons produced by Project Coast were a non-lethal tear gas called CR, which was intended for use as a tool for crowd control. It was similar to CS gas, which is more commonly known, but was stronger and more irritating to the skin and eyes of the people that it was used against. At least 20 tons of CR was produced overall, and about half of that was loaded into munitions, such as tear gas grenades and that sort of thing. A company called Delta G Scientific also produced at least a ton of methaqualone and a ton of MDMA, which are more commonly known as addictive street drugs called quaaludes and ecstasy. But Project Coast also produced some very deadly and very insidious weapons for assassinations and covert action. The primary users of these weapons were two successive organizations. The first was called Barnacle, and it was later replaced by the Civil Cooperation Bureau. Barnacle was founded in late 1979 or early 1980 and was very small, only an estimated 30 to 40 personnel, consisting of a handful of former service members from Rhodesia and current members of the SADF. Barnacle was about 1/3 white and 2/3 black overall. Its mandate was to perform missions that couldn't be undertaken by better known and more conventional elements of the SADF, including what they described as eliminations, such as the murder of troublesome prisoners. Barnacle was so secretive that years later, some of the former members testified in court that any operative who was suspected of being a problem would be killed rather than disciplined or transferred out of the unit. One member was observed making phone calls to Zimbabwe in 1980 and was later killed with a lethal injection, according to that testimony. Barnacle got its start by performing deep reconnaissance missions in the field, but soon moved on to killing captured prisoners from the Southwest Africa People's Organization, known as SWAPO. They even killed some of their own intelligence sources within SWAPO who had become problematic or were simply no longer useful. Some of the early members of Barnacle would fly a light plane to a remote airstrip in Namibia to pick up a prisoner targeted for elimination. Sometimes they'd already be dead, other times they were just unconscious. They'd be flown out over the ocean and jettisoned. The operatives didn't want these bodies washing back up on shore, potentially, with a visible gunshot wound, so they tried various types of tranquilizers and muscle relaxants with various degrees of success. One of the first prisoners they took fought back for almost 15 minutes before he finally stopped breathing. The operative in the back of the plane ended up strangling him with a plastic zip tie. After that, they received stronger chemicals, including a sedative called Vesparax and an anesthetic called Ketalar. Ketalar worked by paralyzing all the body's muscles, including respiratory muscles. So these particular victims of Barnacle would suffocate while remaining fully alert on their final trip out over the ocean. Barnacle made many flights like this, and members later testified that they killed hundreds of SWAPO prisoners using these methods. Very horrifying stuff, honestly. Later, the Civil Cooperation Bureau replaced Barnacle. The name is highly misleading because there was nothing civil or cooperative about it at all. One of the most significant changes were that some members of South African police agencies were brought into the program as well. It was still a heavily compartmentalized organization responsible for performing deniable murders and is now very well known throughout South Africa. So, how was Dr. Ford tied to South African death squads in the 1980s? Well, going back to the search of Ford's home, one other very unusual item was found. In fact, it's not entirely clear what it was based on available documentation now, but I can make an educated guess. The device is described as a special assassination device, which was manufactured by a Rhodesian armorer and machinist named Philip Morgan. According to a report prepared by the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, Morgan got his start working for the government of Rhodesia in the late 1970s, preparing a wide variety of disguised and dual-use devices, such as booby-trapped radios intended to kill insurgents. Morgan went on to work for the Armaments Corporation of South Africa, known as Armscor. He worked in a subsidiary of Armscor called EMLC, which focused on poisons and biological and chemical weapons. One of their apparent tasks was contaminating clothing with an unknown poison which would kill the wearer within hours once they put the clothing on. Not much is known about his work with EMLC, but after that, he went to work with the Civil Cooperation Bureau. At the CCB, he manufactured items including rings with hidden compartments to hold poison pills and screwdrivers, which were actually disguised poison injectors. Morgan also converted umbrellas using a firing mechanism that seemed to exactly replicate the very famous umbrella gun used by Bulgarian agents to murder Georgy Markov in London in 1978, as I've discussed in a previous episode. The umbrellas were made to fire a 3mm polycarbonate ball with tiny holes drilled in it, which were then filled with poison. One of these weapons was transported to London in 1988 and given to an agent of the Civil Cooperation Bureau named Trevor Floyd, who intended to use it to kill two high-ranking members of the African National Congress who were living in London. It's probably not a coincidence that the unsolved murder of Georgy Markov became the basis of a new plan in the same city just 10 years later. It's likely that the device found in Ford's house was one of these screwdrivers or even one of the umbrellas. But why would a California doctor possess a device manufactured for assassinations in South Africa nearly 20 years earlier? How did it get from one place to the other? Ford's ties to murder and intrigue in South Africa go much deeper than a simple disguised weapon. It appears that he first became acquainted with members of the South African government at a medical conference in San Diego sometime in the 1980s. There he met Neil Noble, the Surgeon General who was also overseeing Project Coast. Aside from the very secretive chemical and biological weapons program, the Surgeon General had a serious interest in the prevention and treatment of HIV and AIDS, which was becoming a major health concern in South Africa, just as it was in the US at the same time. So it's natural and understandable that he and Dr. Ford would connect on that. According to Noble, Ford helped him develop the prevention policy for the South African Defense Forces, and the two men became friends after that. Ford traveled to South Africa on at least 6 occasions and even went on a safari hunt with Noble at some point. Noble introduced Ford to Dr. Basson, the head of Project Coast, and the two men began working together not long after that. In 1987, Ford spent a day with some of the researchers from the front company, Delta G Scientific, which produced all the chemical weapons for Project Coast. He showed them how to isolate certain toxins and then infuse them into tea bags and even the pages of Playboy magazine so they'd be picked up by their targets, who would then die of seemingly natural causes. This was obviously a huge departure from the work of HIV and AIDS prevention, and it's not clear to me what the tipping point was. When did Dr. Basson reveal the existence of Project Coast to Ford? Aside from his expertise as a researcher, when did Basson realize that Ford would be willing to help the South African government weaponize bacteria and toxic chemicals for covert operations? Even before that particular trip to South Africa, Ford was already providing weaponized germs to the government. Peter Fitzpatrick, the FBI source I mentioned earlier, saw him at a party at the home of the South African Trade Attaché in Beverly Hills, California, the year before, 1986. Fitzpatrick was a small-time actor in Los Angeles at the time and got to know some members of the South African consulate after helping one of his friends work out a business deal there. He started attending parties with the trade attaché and inviting other minor celebrities and business people, which is fairly normal business for any attaché. Later, he began regularly reporting to the FBI what went on within the consulate. So at this particular event, Fitzpatrick saw Ford hand over a black satchel to the attaché. When he asked about it, the attaché, who I can only assume had had too much to drink already that night, explained in very direct terms that Ford was a microbiologist and the satchel contained various strains of very serious bacteria, including botulism and anthrax. He even said that Ford had provided a new mutated strain of a germ that was, quote, pigment specific, unquote. He was implying that Ford had provided something that would only infect South African blacks and leave the white population unharmed. This seems like an extremely serious allegation, and if Fitzpatrick was in contact with the FBI at that time, what did they do with that information? He described it in an interview with a reporter in 2001 after Ford's suicide. But there's no indication that Ford was ever arrested or even investigated for potentially handing over biological agents to a foreign government. Did the FBI drop the ball? Or is it possible that they went hands off with Ford because of his alleged connections to the CIA or USAM Reed at Fort Detrick? Either of those seem very possible. Just after Ford's death, Fitzpatrick submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to obtain his own file as an informant for the FBI. When he finally received the reports, almost everything was redacted from the body of each report. But the captions on some of them were still visible, and those indicated that his reporting on Larry Ford and on the South African trade attaché were being forwarded to the CIA immediately after they were filed. This was far from the only time Ford handed over a potentially deadly bacterium either. His mistress, Valerie Kesler, traveled with him to South Africa 6 times, and on one occasion saw him remove a vial from his vest pocket and give it to someone at the airport as soon as they arrived. She realized later that he'd been carrying a deadly and contagious disease-causing bacterium on him inside the airplane the entire time. Dr. Basson also stated during his trial that Ford brought him bacteria samples at least 2 times during his trips to South Africa. Ford's motive in all this seems to be a desire to see the minority white population of South Africa maintain control of the country during the apartheid era. His own family hasn't given any interviews in the years since his death, but they spoke very well of him at the time and did not appear to realize he was harboring any dark secrets until afterwards. One of his neighbors later reported that Ford would sometimes speak positively of the white South African government and said that the increased violence that came after that government fell and apartheid ended was being completely ignored by the same people who wanted it gone in the first place. Ford also seemed to be receiving some funds from the South African government in exchange for the samples that he was bringing them. And he was also allowed to take a lot of body fluid samples from hundreds of women at a military hospital in South Africa, which he was using to develop his drug Interconfidence. So he was receiving some support from the South African government in his effort to develop Interconfidence over the years. But it seems like his motivation was primarily ideological more than anything else. Police also found some indications that he may have been in limited contact with some militia groups in the United States in the 1990s, but nothing especially damning came out of that, it appears. In the end, like with so many other stories I've covered here, there is a lot we don't know and a lot we will probably never know. But Dr. Ford's apparent willingness to perform secret medical experiments on patients who trusted him, his willingness to provide biological weapons to foreign governments, and his plan to have his own longtime business partner murdered to increase his own share of Biofilm's profits certainly make him a modern-day mad scientist. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.